So what happened now? Okay, so okay, I'm sorry. I just really so typical, I just realized that I didn't unmute myself. I'm sorry. So I repeat everything. Okay, all right. Maybe somebody who could read lips, so maybe you heard what I said already or you saw it. So welcome to the third edition of AI&I, our virtual edition of our event series, which we normally run in Berlin. I'm Inga Paus, the managing director of the Vodafone Institute, which is the European think tank of the Vodafone Group. I don't know how it is with you, but we find actually the COVID pandemic as challenging as exciting. And challenging because we had to rethink a lot of our daily work, such as running event series like AI&I, which normally take place at very fancy locations in Berlin. And we hope we can continue to do so in a few months. On the other side, it's super exciting because it's such an accelerator for the digital transformation of our societies. And we learn a lot about the positive impacts, but also about the negative impacts of digitization. And this is exactly what we want to discuss today with Stephanie Hare. Stephanie is a researcher on technology, politics, and history, a journalist and a book author. And she has been recently very vocal about digital surveillance, and she will explain why she was so vocal. Alexander Görlach, our host, will introduce Stephanie properly in a minute. And Alexander is joining us from New York this afternoon as mostly, and some might recall him as the editor-in-chief of the European magazine, which he was running for a while. He's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, and he served in various positions at the Harvard University. So Alex, please take over and run us through our third AI&I vTalk, please.
Thanks, Inga. It's a pleasure to be with you guys again. And even though we are at a distance now and not together in Berlin, I feel we have a connection because we care for the topics we discuss here. So a warm hi to Berlin. And now over to Stephanie, who their friends called Steph, and she wanted me to call her Steph too. Steph is a researcher who is exploring the nexus between technology, politics, and history. She holds a PhD and Masters of Science from the London Schools of Economics, and she was a fellow at St. Anthony's College in Oxford, and she is a publicly known commentator and pundit on the intersection of technology and politics and ethics. And I'm glad and happy to be joining the floor with her today and discussing the topics at hand. Stephanie will be giving us a presentation in a minute, and we take it from there, having our conversation about what she's laying out and pointing out, and then having you guys from the audience joining in and clackety-clacking your questions, and we hope to be able to answer all of them during the course of this event. So Stephanie, or Steph, please, yeah, the floor is yours.
Lovely. And I would like to say, first of all, thank you so much to Inga and Alexander and everybody at the Vodafone Institute for the opportunity to come and speak, and to Alejandro, who is producing this and who's in my ear right now and soon to be in my heart, I suspect, as he helps me with the PowerPoint slides. But also I'd like to give a warm welcome and hello to everybody who's watching this both now and in the future, because this will be stored forever on the internet, which isn't scary at all. So Alejandro, if we can have the first slide of the PowerPoint presentation, we'll see if the magic works. This is a dialogue that we are hosting with people in Berlin. I'm here in London. Alex is in New York, and hopefully you all are everywhere, but we're all on the internet, which suggests that the singularity is perhaps closer than we thought. So I've been asked to talk about big data and AI-based technologies and whether they're helping or harming. And I came up with an agenda that's going to take us about 10 minutes. If you need to time your tea break, or if you just want to have this on in the background while you're doing other stuff that's possibly more interesting, though what could be 10 minutes of me chatting on my own, and then we're going to get into the meat, which is the conversation with Alexander and hopefully questions from you. Heckling on Twitter is welcomed and encouraged. Harebrain is my handle. If you would like to message, I will probably also be discreetly taking a look, but I'm sure the Vodafone Institute people will as well. So if you'd like to feed in from Twitter, we're listening. So 3 points that we're going to discuss today. One, speaker introduction. Why is this person in front of you right now. A very important question. To mission impossible, how on earth to be optimistic and positive during a pandemic. That was the request I was given, was not to do my usual doom and gloom of risk analysis, but to actually try and tell a positive story about tech, which I said challenge accepted. And then last but not least is what I'm going to invite all of you to join me with, and Alexander in particular, which is an invitation to a thought experiment. So after the pandemic, what technology worked, what didn't work and why, and then what we might learn from this experience once we finally get through it, because we will get through it, so that we could potentially apply it to the next one, or indeed another global crisis. So Alejandro, if we could have the next slide, and indeed the next one after that, we'll go straight into the speaker intro. And voila. I wanted to sort of demonstrate some street credibility with you right up front, which is that when I say I have a long-standing interest and indeed passion for telecommunications and technology, I'm not messing around. I'd like to thank my mother, who I think is watching this, but hopefully not heckling, for sending this photo circa the 1970s. I'm over the age of 40, so I won't tell you exactly which year, but it's from the Jurassic age of the 1970s with my first telephone. And we've upgraded ever so slightly since. Not Vodafone on that one, Vodafone on this one. So next slide, please. That little chatty baby has grown up into a chatty adult. So I'm now an independent researcher and broadcaster by way of being seriously nerdy, as you can see in the education section. Started out doing a bachelor's of liberal arts and sciences at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. So hence the American accent. I am indeed from across the pond. Then I came over here at a tender age via the Sorbonne in Paris, because I was a French historian by training first before I did tech, and went to the London School of Economics, where I nerded out very happily doing a Master's of Science in Theory and History of International Relations, and then a PhD. You'll see in the experience section above that that's kind of where the technology side came in. I started out in 2000, which was when companies were just hiring people based on potential and not because they had, for instance, a computer science degree. So I really lucked out. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it was possible then, and should in theory be possible now, for anyone to work in technology and to come from a very diverse background. And you'll see that my background was also by way of languages, first talking to humans, then talking to machines. So you'll note hidden in the second bullet point that I've got a book coming out on technology ethics soon. It's been slightly delayed by the pandemic, and I'm writing a chapter on this experience, about which more in a moment. So next slide, Alejandro, please. Thank you. So we're at Mission Impossible. What is that? If we can have the next one. I feel an affinity with Tom Cruise in this scene. I was asked when we first started talking about this to give a positive and optimistic outlook of big data and AI-based technologies. And that's, I think, a really hard ask today, because we are in a pandemic where every day here in the UK at 5 o'clock, the government announces the death tolls in this country. And we are now looking at over 60,000 excess deaths here. And we're in a country that's going to be one of the hardest hit of OECD economies. I'm from the United States, which has an even worse record in terms of protecting people. So we've got over 120,000 people dead in the United States from COVID alone. That's not even the other deaths, that's just from COVID. And the stat that you see in my slide here is unfortunately out of date. I finished this at 2 in the morning, but it's out of date already, alas, because it's not 40 million people who are unemployed now it's 45 million. We've also had a very rough couple of weeks with the police protesting with members of the US demos for various reasons that I'm sure we're all aware of. And I was literally sitting at this desk watching an American journalist arrested live on television very recently. We've got a presidential election in 5 months that's going to shape the outlook for many things around the world. And I wasn't feeling very optimistic, but then Vodafone made me decide to challenge my normal doom and gloom and risk analysis, which is really the background I've been doing for a while. And some things happened which have changed my perspective ever so slightly. So it's not just rationalism, it's empiricism. So we'll have the next slide, please. Facial recognition technology, some good news. Who was expecting that one? Certainly not me. There's some fine print, though, as we'll see with the asterisk at the bottom. So read the terms and conditions of this good news. So if we could have the next slide. Just to recap, for those of you who do not spend your time thinking about facial recognition 24/7, and I applaud you for having more interesting lives, facial recognition is a form of biometrics technology and surveillance technology. So your biometrics is quite simply data about your body. Now, most of us from watching crime shows are aware that the police will sometimes take DNA or fingerprints from a crime scene to use in investigations, and that is usually covered quite clearly in law. So that's what the first generation technology is on the top right-hand corner of the screen. So there's laws that sort of regulate this for specific use only. You're not allowed to give this to other branches of the government or to private companies. So we've covered those two forms of body data, but we have not covered in law all of the other different parts of your body that could be turned into code and therefore analysis and control. And that's your face, that's your emotions, that's your voice, that's the way you walk, which is known as your gait, your eyes, your actual iris, eyes, your finger geometry. So that's like the actual distance of your fingers to your hands and the ratios and measurements. You can measure that stuff out. And then anything you can measure, you can turn into code and do stuff with it. So quite important. You can even do heartbeats, vein prints. So each one of us is this beautiful thing walking around utterly unique in nature, like little special snowflakes we all are. And we can translate that into zeros and ones. You could even potentially get people's behavior and turn that into code. So you're going to have a certain signature when you type, which could be quite interesting, which is why all of the workplace surveillance we're hearing about in this day and age of working from home is quite important. Why does your employer need to know all of that stuff about you? So I have put down under the bottom left corner that the creepy factor here, for me, personal opinion, is face and emotions. Face, because it can be tracked with facial recognition technology without your knowledge. I mean, forget consent. You wouldn't even know that it's being used on you. And it's probably been used on you and you just don't know it yet in many countries. And then emotions, which is that certain companies like to think that there's only like 7 emotions, which I find hysterical. But it's like 7 primary colors. No, there are many, many more colors and many, many more emotions than our friends in tech like to think. But they want to be able to use it to be able to scan crowds to see, for instance, when people are going to get violent at a protest or maybe at a football match or whatever. This is really where your imagination is your only limitation. So important for us to know that all of that stuff has not been regulated yet, pretty much anywhere. So I know my friends who are very interested in the GDPR will have comments on that, and I would love to acknowledge that, and we'll do that later in Q&A or on Twitter, I'm sure. So if we could have the next slide. This is a really important concept, which is biometrics and the extended self. So we just talked about all the data that you could get off of a person's body, from their DNA to their face, their fingerprints, all that good stuff. Even my voice right now is being turned and parsed into all sorts of exciting tech to go over this computer and into your ears. But my phone might have Face ID, so you could use my face to go onto my phone. Well, I could use my face. I might have a thumb ID that's just taken my thumbprint. I probably shouldn't hold that close up to the camera, but I'm going to. Go ahead, make a hash. It's not even my real thumb. You would take that and you would turn it into a hash, which is just a mathematical representation of your thumbprint, and then I and my device communicate happily, only I can get into it. Super, right? You could potentially do that to get into your house, your car, your place of work. You might be using some of these things at school. You might use this around your city. You could potentially use it in your country. So when you're crossing borders, you might have your face scanned when you go through security and customs at the airport, or indeed the Eurostar, as has just been announced. So just worth thinking about. You have the next slide, Alejandro. Thank you. I'd really like to call out the fantastic scholarship of some colleagues across the pond over in the United States, who I've indicated with a very unsubtle red arrow. So this is the Gender Shades Project. And if you haven't checked it out, I really encourage you to do so, because this comes from 2018. It's the totally badass name of the Algorithmic Justice League Project. And the scholars here basically started testing different forms of facial recognition to see if it worked for identifying gender. And then what it ended up coming up with is that unfortunately the algorithms only work very well on people who happen to be white men, which is a very interesting problem. And that becomes a social problem and not just a technical problem, because if you are to deploy technology that only accurately recognizes the faces of white men, for instance, and misidentifies the faces of people with darker skin, or gets their gender wrong in a crime situation when the police are looking for a suspect and cannot tell if they are looking for a man or a woman, or if they are looking for somebody with one skin tone versus another. We can debate all we like about whether they should be doing that at all, but that's just the way that policing is at the moment. Then we would at least want the tech to be accurate. That doesn't solve the problem, because the problem of the social consequences of this technology remain, but there's an accuracy problem at the moment, and it was the Gender Shades project in the United States that really kicked it off. So kudos to those scholars, and I really hope that you take a look at that if you're interested in this technology. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. That was in 2018 for Gender Shades. In January of 2020, so I know it seems like 8 million years ago because the pandemic has warped everybody's sense of time, mine included, but we're only in June. So 6 months ago, we had a CEO of a major Silicon Valley company, Alphabet, which is the parent of Google, call for a moratorium on facial recognition. So Google has been working on facial recognition this whole time and could be selling its technology to law enforcement around the world, but it's not. And it would be really interesting to find out the reasons why. And they've talked about it a bit. I'm not going to go into that here. We can address that in Q&A, but I just wanted to signal that because of what comes in the next slide. So if we can pop to that one, Alejandro. The next slide was the big one, and this is the one that makes the mission impossible possible, which is that on the week of June 8th, my jaw dropped 3 times. It was genuinely amazing history and making to watch, which is that IBM came out and announced that it was abandoning facial recognition products entirely. Now, tech companies do this all the time, so that's not necessarily very interesting, not maybe a huge part of their business. Why is it interesting? It's interesting because while abandoning that technology, they decided to write a letter to the US Congress and inform members there that they think this technology is racially biased. And they did so in a context of the Black Lives Matter protest movement that has been happening right now because of police brutality in the United States. So they took what is a strategic and operational decision and politicized it. And that was very deliberate. Not long after, Amazon became the second big US titan to do this. They said that they were going to pause their use of facial recognition software and the selling thereof to US police departments for 1 year. And they said they were doing this, again, watch the politicization of this move. They were doing this to give the US Congress time to regulate it. And they said that if the US Congress needs any help, to give them a call. Remembering that we're in an election year, these are not neutral words. Now, Amazon is a much bigger player in this space than IBM. Amazon did not say if it was going to stop selling its technology to other branches of the US government, federal government, Department of Homeland Security, ICE, for instance, which has been used to hunt down immigrants and separate children from parents. So there's a lot going on there behind that. That's what I meant about read the small print. But that Amazon announcement was significant because it got attention. It put pressure on Microsoft, which is the third company in our hat trick of companies that abandoned facial recognition for 1 year at least. Microsoft really had to do this because their president, Brad Smith, wrote a book called Tools and Weapons, which talks all about how they're trying to use technology ethically and responsibly. Anyone, of course, who's in Washington state and has been following Microsoft's moves to water down any attempts to regulate the tech there in that state will be confused because they haven't been very, helpful in getting rid of this tech in one state in the union, but they've gone along with this movement on a federal level. So interesting. What I would like to just draw our attention to here is that those 3 companies, which are US companies, are only talking about not giving their tech to US police departments. We know nothing about their position for the rest of the world. This raises problems, of course, because we've seen this movie before in which US companies decide that US citizens and residents have a different standard than the rest of the world. So that is enough about the small print to get us started at least. Let's go on to the next slide, please. Bottom line, significant, but insufficient. We need regulation, not self-regulation of surveillance technology. So I'm optimistic and positive on what just happened, but totally not good enough. There's many, many more companies out there that make this technology, both in the United States and outside it. And they will just simply sell to the US police departments and continue selling around the world. So we need governments to step up, and they kind of need to do it now. I'm not quite sure why they're dragging their feet on this, but perhaps they will be encouraged. Next slide, please. So number 2, good news story number 2, contact tracing apps. For British viewers and listeners here and later, I'm sure that you will be understanding my bemusement in what we're about to discuss, because the United Kingdom has been having a journey, it could be said, with its contact tracing app, which literally just changed about 2 hours before this presentation. And I honestly couldn't be bothered to update the slide because I kind of wanted to use it to make the point. This country is evolving so weirdly with its journey on tech that we want to call it out. So for now, let's stick to what was current as of 2 a.m. this morning, which is that we've got the New York Times here on the left saying that Europe rolls out contact tracing apps with hope and trepidation. And that's because over on the continent, across the English Channel, many countries have already rolled out their app. Well done, them. Most of them have gone with a decentralized model that is based on the Google Apple API. So what that is, an API is just the software that allows any government to then build its own app, right? And then you can download the app from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store. So it isn't that Google and Apple are building the app. They are not. Each country builds the app. They're just able to use this API. So the United Kingdom and France, being of an exceptionally minded nature, Entente Cordiale continues, both decided for reasons that we can discuss to use a centralized model. So they rejected the Google Apple offer, though remaining in regular contact with them, and decided they were going to build their own centralized system. The difference between this, for those of us who are not complete nerds, decentralized is just simply that all of your data and anyone that you're coming in contact with is going to be staying on your phone. It's never going to go to a centralized server that Big Brother or big government can have a look at and make lists off of and do stuff with. It's just between you and your devices, or your device. In the case of France and in the United Kingdom, until about 3 hours ago, we were going to be going with a centralized model, which is that the government was going to get that data. And that might include location data, it might include your testing status, all of that stuff. Most other countries just didn't go with that. So fine, whatever, it's science. We're going to be trying a bunch of different experiments here and see where we are at the end of the year. So if we can go back to that slide, please. The one just before, if you don't mind. Super, thank you. So really important to understand that, because it's easy to be critical and cynical, but today is the day for being optimistic and positive. So we are in a real-time multi-country experiment. Most of these apps, other than a few in Asia, have only just been spun up now. And the ones that were in Asia were because those countries had been through things like SARS and avian flu and MERS. And so they were just ready to go. Unfortunately, for reasons that we can discuss, other countries were not as prepared for this pandemic and they had to get their apps going from scratch, and hence it's taken them a couple of months. Up they go. But third bullet point, so far, even in Asia, no app has been a game changer. Uptake has been too low in every country. Now that sounds like doom and gloom, so let's be optimistic. That was for the first wave. We have, they say, 12 to 18 months before a vaccine, should one be found, would be available. And to be honest, I think it would take much longer to mass produce it, roll it out. So we're going to be living with this virus for years unless some sort of thing happens and it burns itself out. So we might as well try apps and see if any of them work. So who cares if it hasn't worked yet? Like, let's look to the future. I mean, it's interesting what's happened in the past, but we're future focused right now because we want to try and solve this. So next slide. Super. This This is the result of a very long day that I had 2 months ago, in which I took the Johns Hopkins University School of Public Health contact tracing course, which is 8 hours of online fun and free. So anyone in the world can take it. And I took it because before I got into deciding if the centralized or the decentralized model was the best and blah, blah, blah with the tech stuff, I wanted to understand the medical stuff, the thing I was most ignorant about, which was how does this virus work? And the news is not great. One of the reasons why an app might help is that you'll see down in the bottom part of the slide here, this period that's identified as the window of opportunity. This virus, this novel coronavirus, moves very fast. The problem is that once you've been infected, for the first 48 hours, you're not going to be feeling any symptoms and displaying any symptoms, but you will be contagious. So by the time you might start showing your symptoms, it's going to be on day 3 of your infection period. So you would have, for instance, potentially a fever, although not all cases have fever, potentially a cough. There are 14 symptoms now that we correlate with this virus. You might start showing those symptoms on day 3 of your infection. You would need to be able to report those symptoms, get a test, get the test results back, and then either your app is able to beam out that positive test result to your contacts, anonymized, of course. Those people would just get an alert that they came into contact with someone in the past 72 hours who has tested positive. So you can see where the technological solution is very attractive. It's really difficult for classic human contact tracing to be able to act that quickly. That said, while that window of opportunity is so narrow and while tech potentially could be part of the solution, the fact remains human contact tracing is helping and is working. So we don't want to go, it's not an either or do we do human or the app? You're going to do both. You're always going to do both. It's whether or not the app will help. So I hope that's clear. And this presentation will be available afterwards for anyone who does not want to take the course, but just wants that slide. So if we could have the next slide then, please, Alejandro. Thanks so much. Apologies for putting myself into the presentation, which is looking very weird on my screen. There's a lot of my own head here, but I unfortunately, for better or for worse, waded into this because here in the United Kingdom, where I mentioned we're having a journey of discovery about what we are doing with the app. That's the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, over on the left. And he gave a little speech, many speeches, in fact, about a month ago, saying that the UK population had a duty to download the app that we were building, which was centralized, not using the Google, Apple API, not the privacy preserving option, not the option that everyone else is doing except for France. He wanted us to do it. And there's lots of appealing about duty, as though we're in The Crown, that wonderful show. And maybe it's a British cultural thing that their behavioral psychology unit thought Brits would respond to an appeal for duty. I, being a pain in the ass American immigrant, came over and wrote the article that you see on the right, which is that if you have to appeal to somebody out of their sense of duty to download an app, your tech has failed. No one wants to download an app out of a sense of duty. They want to download it because it makes their life better in some way, right? So like, I've got a few apps on my phone. I've got WhatsApp right now because WhatsApp is super handy. It allows me to stay in touch with family and friends, and right now with the producer of this show, right? So we're messaging about all of you right now. I've got Twitter because that's useful. Something I can sign up for yoga classes, right? Like stuff that makes my life easier. If I'm going to download an app that is a health app, I'm only going to do it if it makes me healthy and keeps me safe. And hopefully, if I'm civic minded, if it keeps other people around me safe. This app that has been currently trialed here in the United Kingdom did not do that. And I felt it was my duty as a technologist to call out why. In fairness to Mr. Hancock and his colleagues, I think it's really hard what we're doing right now, right? It's very easy to just sort of judge bad efforts and bad attempts, but people are acting with a lot of very fast moving information. There's political dimensions to all of this and mistakes are going to be made. So I am delighted with the news that the United Kingdom has decided to pivot. We have, however, been given quite confused messages as of last night that this app wasn't even going to be ready until winter. That was before they announced today that we are pivoting to the Google Apple API-based model that everyone else is using. So who knows? Perhaps by the time I'm done giving this keynote, the UK government will have made a new announcement. We'll all be enlightened. And isn't that a good way to make policy? So on to the next slide, please. So different journeys, different paths. This was accurate at 2 o'clock in the morning, but as we've just described, is not. I wanted to show that one of the exciting things about living in a 24-hour connected world is benchmarking, and that you don't have to be an expert to pay attention to what is happening. So again, for our friends in the UK design section who are listening to this, everyone here in Britain has been watching to see that Germany and France and everyone else was getting their app out and wondering why we didn't have one, which is still not actually the most interesting question. The interesting question is, will it work? But let's start at the beginning, which is, why does everyone else manage to get an app out in 3 months and we didn't? We all started at the same starting point. Coronavirus arrives here in Europe around the same time. And you will see, I wanted to put it in as a sort of wink and a nod to my German hosts, that the German coronavirus tracing app was downloaded 6.5 million times in the first 24 hours, which is pretty good. Still not enough though. So we will want to hear and discuss what that threshold is of German phone users to know, what does success look like? And that's going to be part of our thought experiment at the end. What does success look like? How are we going to measure it? How do we know if we've gotten there or not? So, and there's the one on the right, which is the health minister saying the app would roll out by winter. Is that useful? Maybe. Maybe you don't want to launch it now. Maybe you want to launch it when flu season hits and the NHS is getting slammed. I don't know. I hope that we get more information about that. But a tale in 3 slides, or 3 pictures. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. This is the bottom line on contact tracing apps, in my humble opinion. We are soon, very soon, going to have a global data set that's going to tell us whether any of the contact tracing apps played a positive role, a negative role, or just a neutral role, like we don't really know, didn't seem to be a game changer, in breaking the chain of transmission. Remembering that window of opportunity, so small, so narrow, accuracy is paramount. So that's good. We need to know, because unfortunately, I don't think anyone is under any illusion now that this is the only pandemic that we are at risk of now. This has, if anything, been an amazing stress test and very humbling for all of us to understand quite how connected and vulnerable we all are. So we need to know if apps work. And if they don't work, why? Because conditions might change and then they might become viable again. If they do work, why? If they only work in some countries versus others, why? Will 5G make a difference with any of this? I don't know. It's just a factor I'm raising right now. So we have to acknowledge and have the humility to understand that we are conducting an experiment. These are experimental technologies. They may fail. That doesn't mean they weren't worth doing. And I know it's really hard because they cost money and time, and people have to spend effort on them that maybe could have been deployed more usefully elsewhere. That's only something you get to know in hindsight, unless you're one of the truly brilliant people who sees very clearly. But you know, how many of us fit that description, to be honest? So a bit of humility and acknowledgement to our colleagues in government that this is tough work, and applauding them to keep going. So keep going. And on that note, we'll keep going to the next slide. There we go. Well, that's our discussive learning from failures and successes. This is the New York Times right now saying that England's world-beating system to track the virus is anything but. An article that I recommend reading, not for a bit of England bashing or indeed UK bashing, although the UK is not just England. Our friends in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, who I hope will be watching, have been doing things a little bit differently. So there's micro experiments happening even within the UK. Just like in the United States, there's 50 states who will be doing different things, and even different cities. So the data set will be so rich. We will be wiser at the end of this. So next slide. Thank you very much. This is for all of us. This is just now that I've kind of got us warmed up. We're all primed and hopefully a bit pissed off, maybe, a bit excited. Invitation to a thought exercise after the pandemic. Right now, we're just at the beginning of this, right? So we started in January, we're June. Those of us in Europe or in the United States are only just 3 months into this, but our friends in Asia, and particularly in China, have been doing this for 6 months. So I think it's safe to say that we're all a bit tired. One day though, let's pick a year, 2025, this is going to be over. And a bunch of people are going to have the job of looking back. And their job will be to go, of all the different things that we learned about this virus and how we got through, what worked, what didn't, how can we apply what we've learned to the next pandemic or epidemic, if it's going to be regionally specific, but also other crises. And that part is really interesting because just because we're dealing with a public health crisis now doesn't mean it's the only global crisis that we could be dealing with or that we may already be dealing with. Climate change being an obvious example of that, food security being another, supply chain management, perhaps terrorism stuff. There's going to be, and there have been many times when we have to come together as a planet and as a group of countries and people to use technology to solve big, complicated, long-term problems. So I'm hoping to open this up. I will stop chatting, hand over to Alex, and we can start a Q&A discussion with all of you and between the two of us about what we think we might learn from this. What do we want to start thinking about now so that we're ready for that chat? And thank you ever so much for your patience.
Thanks a lot, Steph. That was a lot to think about. And on your last note on the discussion, to kick that off, my impression is now, especially if you look into Germany and the reaction, so we had some protests against the corona measures the government took. It was small, but still. But it highlights the thing, like when technology is successful, meaning like we didn't have as many dead people, the death toll is not like in the UK or the United States, then people seem to be rolling back and saying, oh, it's not as bad as we thought. So why did we do all these infringements on our civic rights and whatnot? So my question is, like, when technology is successful, we seem to be like not acknowledge it, and when it's not successful, we start hating it. And how do we escape this sort of dilemma?
That's such a good point. I guess like this would almost relates to like getting vaccinated. You know, so it's like, I didn't get measles. We didn't get measles as a school, or my kid's primary school, we didn't have a measles outbreak. Why did we bother? It's like, so perhaps that raises the question of literacy. And by that, I mean sort of scientific literacy or technological literacy, to understand that, you know, first do no harm, and that, you know, I'm in the country of Jeremy Bentham here in the United Kingdom. So it's all about, you know, maximize benefit, minimize harm. So what does it mean to not launch a bad app, right? It's almost like a double negative. I actually think it's very good that the United Kingdom has not launched what would have been a bad app. That suggests to me they are actually listening. And you know what, if they got it wrong at the beginning, is that annoying? Yes, of course it's annoying. Which of us has not done something really annoying at work or in our own lives where we're like, if I had just gotten that right the first time, it'd be so much easier and better. We can't all be Germany. I wish we could, and figure it all out ahead of time. Germany had a lot of things to its advantage in terms of its testing capability and the way that it's structured around. And, you know, I'm not going to be the American describing to the German why Germany has done so well. You can perhaps enlighten us, but preparedness is also part of that, so that you aren't simply firefighting when you're reacting to a crisis. You can actually have a strategic plan. What's mystifying is that here in the UK and in so many other countries, the pandemic was the #1 risk on their risk radar. They did all of the role playing and strategy scenario tabletop exercises, and this still happened. So what's that about?
Well, I mean, and that's maybe very broadly brushed, but like you see, like countries, not only Germany, but Taiwan and New Zealand, run by female leaders, and the German leader being like a scientist herself, that led to a complete different approach and outcome, obviously, than like in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Brazil. So all these countries with autocrats or autocrat-friendly or wannabe autocratic leaders who think they can just like solve the problem all by themselves and not collectively, as in like using data and whatnot. So I feel like that's maybe a bit broad, but as a German, I want to be like humble enough to say that's not only been the Germans. Look at the island democracy of Taiwan. It's or New Zealand, like that you have, So, but like the literacy kind of aspect from the beginning, I want to go back to the beginning of your presentation, as in like there is so much we do not know what of us in terms of our biometric self can be used algorithmically, I say, like, or in what you said about the thumb and our emotions, and how if we don't know that this can be used, we can also not prepare, and we can also not raise our voice as citizens. So how do we bridge that gap?
Yeah.
All
So
by your book, I know, but like other than that,
only buy my book if you have problems sleeping, because it will put you to sleep. My publisher will hate me for saying that, but it is an insomnia cure. I guarantee it. No, I think the point you raise is really interesting, because we're not just talking about a technology that you can opt into or not. So lots of people, for instance, sort of like to complain about social media, to which the response is, well, if you don't like it, no one's forcing you to go on Facebook, right? Which is probably true. It's really different because you cannot opt out of facial recognition in London. You can't. It's all over the place, including in London's King's Cross, where it was being used for 22 months in secret. So like, how are you supposed to opt out of that? The owner of the land, which is where the Eurostar terminal is, I don't know how many people know this, but I mean, you've got Google there, you've got the Guardian newspaper there, so all those journalists and their sources and everyone walking around would have been being tracked. Were having their faces tracked for nearly 2 years, and the Metropolitan Police and the British Transport Police denied that they were involved in it, and then had to do a U-turn and admit that they were, which suggests they either don't know what they're doing or that there's an honesty problem there. We don't really know, because the Information Commissioner's Office has still not told us if that was legal or not, right? So all of those people who for 2 years were having their faces taken and compared against God knows what databases, how do you consent to that? How do you opt out of that if you don't know? And if the regulator won't pronounce if it's legal or not, how are we supposed to sue or not? Everybody's just sort of permanently on pause here. And you can only blame Brexit for so long. I know it's crazy making, but eventually we need a decision. Is that stuff legal or not? And if it's legal, then maybe we have to change the law. So we've got Lord Clement Jones here in the House of Lords has put forward a private members bill, which will get a hearing in 2021. So it's a wait for that. It would be refreshing to see the people in the Houses of Commons doing something, but they've got an 80-seat majority with this current government. So if the Tories don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. So where is Labour on that, right? And that's going to be true for every country around the world. They can't wait for companies to just keep self-regulating it, because, it's great if Amazon wants to not sell for a year, but our friends over at Hikvision and NEC, which is a Japanese company, or TrueFace, or Clearview AI, which is just scraping everybody's profiles from the internet, so that you're basically Google searching people's face, they're going for it. So what are we supposed to do? It's very threatening for democracy.
In fact, it is, and there's actually like a question from the community that is catering to that. How do we weigh the risks and benefits of analysis like facial and emotional recognition? What is the path to lower the risk of unintended consequences of these technologies? And I guess that caters to lawmaking and regulation, I feel.
Yeah, so on the one hand, like, we want the police and the security services to have really good technology to help them, because we all want to be safe, and we've got we've got terrorism crimes, we've got knife crimes, we've got ordinary crime. So if these technologies can help them, that's worth entertaining. And so what we would expect to see, again, I think we have to see probably in Parliament. I think this is where you would have one of those expert testimony sessions where the public can feed in, citizen juries can feed in, and different experts feed in, including members of the police and law enforcement, to say why they feel they need it. And that's where you would parse out and separate. These are the things we think that would be great about it. These are the harms that we acknowledge. Do we think it's worth it or not? And that's where voting comes in. We decide as a society, yes, we would love to have it, or absolutely not, this sounds totally scary. That is not what's happening now. Right now, it's just like mold proliferating, and you don't even know where it is. The private sector is getting a free pass. At least the police have to inform the public when they're trialing this technology. Private sector, not at all.
And that leads actually back to Taiwan as a prime example of tackling the crisis, because there has been in place and has been used during the pandemic a public-private partnership where just to brush it broadly, like where government agencies and private entities try to work together for the common good, if you want to call it like that. And that's leading to the question I have from the community. What do you think about self-regulation in the industry? Because one could argue that this can help guide legislation in the infancy stages of new tech. And you highlighted how Microsoft, IBM and Amazon finally came around and were like speaking up or out, like triggered by current events. So you can argue to what extent it was like an intrinsically driven ethical decision or like a pushed one, or they just like it was an eye-opening event. We cannot tell, but that could be like an interesting example in regard to self-regulation of industry. What do you think about that?
I think it's really encouraging. And that's where I have to say I got that wrong. I would never have expected it would be companies pushing back on government, because normally tech companies in particular hate to be regulated, right? And in the United States in particular, the word regulation is like a swear word. In Washington, they just don't want to be regulated. So why do they? The cynical part of me is like, they don't want to be regulated for good reasons. What they just want is for someone to make them a nice market that they can then play in and avoid lawsuits, maybe. Fair enough. But at the same time, it has put the ball back in government's court. I mean, I just don't understand how you could be a member of your parliament or in the US Congress and not have a view on this now. And if your constituents are writing to you or emailing you or phoning you saying, what is your position on this? I come from one state in Illinois in the United States that, for reasons I need to still explore, has the leading biometrics protections in the nation and therefore probably in the world. I mean, it is tough. And that means that Google and Facebook can be sued in ways that they can't in the rest of the country. Now, Illinois did that in 2008, before this technology really took off. So that would be a really interesting case study to be like, in that case, the legislators got ahead of the game and they set the market, right? They set the terms and conditions of how that can be used in Illinois. Can that be replicated across the United States? We saw here in the European Union with the GDPR, with the General Data Protection Regulation, when the EU passed that and it came into effect 2 years ago now in 2018, that had ripple effects across the world. So there's this little dance back and forth between governments and between companies. It's just interesting that in this case, the pressure is coming from companies. So I take your questioner's point. I want to hear from the companies what they think is right. Do they all think that? What's their industry view? And does that differ by country?
I mean, we have been seeing in other cases too that the employees of Google and other giants have been taking active stands in the policy of their company, which I find quite interesting, as in seeing like the inner debate or the inner culture within Facebook or Google and whatnot. But let's rest for a second on the United States, as we were talking about democracy and voting. And then we also talked about like that non-democratic systems might apply these technologies in a total different way, like the People's Republic of China and whatnot. But like at the core, like America, and I live here now in my 6th year. It's all true what they say about the markets and like deregulate and the things that you highlighted. But there is a difference between not believing in single-payer healthcare and let 120,000 people die. So I feel like, to me, the basic justification and the legitimacy of the state is to protect the citizens. So do we have, in the lack of response in the United Kingdom and in the United States of America, also like a totally analogous, not related to technology at all, lack of understanding and integrity into what a state is like about? And on the other hand, like, now we see the civic rights movement, Black Lives Matter, and it gained traction and it gained support. But like at the height of the corona pandemic in the United States, you wouldn't have the citizens protesting on the street and demanding the government to provide for them. Now, if you get into a hospital, you have to still pay $15,000 to get your corona treatment, and many people don't have that. So, where I'm headed at is like, you have these autocratic systems who apply technology, but then you have Western free and democratic societies like the United States, where there seems to be like an ideological disconnect to even use these technologies properly. We're not talking about abuse. It's just like no interest in engaging in protecting your citizens.
Oof, as a meaty challenge there. I think there's something about the social contracts and how that differs from country to country that you've raised that's really interesting. So before we even put the technology layer on top of that, There's, the founding of the United States. It's in its, I think, 244th year next month. I'm a bicentennial baby, so I think it's 244 years. Or even here in the UK or France or Germany, and I'm just picking those countries, there would be very different relations between government and citizens in any country in the world. And then you put technology on top of it, and what you do is you amplify that. Where that becomes interesting in an international relations perspective is who makes the tech. So if you are living in Peru, or Ecuador, or any country in Africa, or a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, and to be honest, for some of us around the world, it doesn't matter. Your terms of engagement are being dictated by companies largely on the west coast of the United States, unless it's China, because China has also been extremely aggressive in using its technology companies. Huawei is one that I've looked at quite closely, but there are many others. That's part of their sort of diplomacy. I think it's part of their foreign policy, and part of them becoming a superpower is through their technology companies. So where does that leave the rest? You could have some European companies hopefully reflecting and embedding European values. What does that mean for countries in other parts of the world? I picked Peru as an example. What choice do citizens have there? And those technologies have values. So Mark Zuckerberg is making real decisions about Facebook in terms of elections and political advertising and transparency, that one sometimes wonders how aware he is of how dangerous transparency can be in other places where human rights, for instance, are not respected in the same way. And I know he's advised well and is reflective, but sometimes the policies don't seem to really make sense. And I think those social media companies in the US are having a moment. Are the Chinese companies, though? So it's easy to bash Silicon Valley, but is anybody looking at Chinese companies or European companies? There's many based right here who I think if people knew about them more would maybe question those values too. And who makes the tech? How representative is it of the world? If you look at most AI ethics papers, most of them are being written by people in Western Europe and North America and a bit from Australia. That's going to reflect that.
Yeah, I have another a question, seems to be like a little critical. It's saying when activating the GA app, it turns out Android turn on GPS. Why? Why trust GA to adhere to privacy?
So when activating the app, what does it do? Sorry, I missed a part of it.
It turns out Android turn on GPS. Why? Why trust?
Oh, they're saying that it's turning on Android's GPS. That's really interesting. I would say to the person asking that question that as an iPhone user, I haven't actually played with this regarding Google and Apple Store, the Google Play Store, excuse me. So I don't want to even attempt to bluff my way through this. What I would say is I'd love to hear about that, because Google has gotten in trouble in the past for people trying to turn off location tracking, and then it still is on. So I'm going to confess full ignorance. I have no idea, and I would love to hear more. So if you're happy to tweet that to me, or send me a direct message on Twitter, I'd be really happy to look into it. I don't know, so I won't fake that I do.
But talking about Google and the Silicon Valley that you just mentioned and compared or looked into China at the same time, one could argue that beyond like ideological political differences, you could find a global consensus of about like protecting humankind. So you could have in theory a project where America, I mean not now obviously, but the United States and China and Russia and all these players we usually don't like and the free world work together in order to tackle like the pandemic, and technology can help us. So because we want to be like a more optimistic, and obviously it seems like technology can facilitate something that people are not willing to take. Because if you talk about advantages and disadvantages, it's always about the application of technology. Technology per se, in my opinion, is usually design neutral and depending on the context in which it's used. So why are we lacking still? Like, why can we not live up to the potential of technology?
Ooh, I mean, I'd have to, if we were like in person, I would have to arm wrestle you over the statement that technology is neutral, because I come from a very different view. I don't think it's neutral at all.
It depends on
we can save that fight.
I mean,
no, go ahead.
No, I think like mostly the intention why created is a positive one. So like nuclear fusion was not like, oh yeah, let's kill humankind. It was more like, oh, but then you realize, there's a disadvantage to it. What do we do now? So that was what I was alluding to.
Yes.
But anyhow, just
no,
to,
it's
if
okay.
we here, that's no problem.
So let's imagine that we are all on Earth and we're facing an existential threat, and it could be like an asteroid that's barreling at us from the sky, or it's climate change, which is just like a slow, steady cooking of us, which I think is happening, according to all of the data, just to alarm everyone. Like, we are actually in that situation now and have been for some time. Why are we not working well together and using technology and transcending all of our petty human foibles to use that to solve the problem? I mean, all you have to do is just look at what happened when Donald Trump was elected and he pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. I mean, everybody came together in a spirit of sort of kumbaya and urgency. And then you have one of the biggest A, polluters, and B, international actors pull out for his own reasons. I don't want to comment in terms of why he did or didn't, just to say that all you need is for key players to not participate in the group effort. And then other countries maybe don't want to be as serious or involved, right? So there's that. There's also the thing of like what we do as individuals versus, is it really like the top 100 most polluting companies that we need to be targeting, rather than guilt tripping me that I have like not turned into a vegan yet, which I might not be doing for health reasons or something, right? So there's the whole like what individuals can do with technology or not, what we can do at the level of our community, our country, and even at planetary level, that if we don't all work together, it's not, particularly on that particular crisis, it's not going to work. And that's where we need really good transparency and accountability mechanisms. You know, there's a lot of people talking, I think it's called greenwashing. It's like with ethics washing. They claim to be very climate friendly, or they claim to be building ethical technology, and then you just realize it's just marketing. It's not really backed up by anything, and in fact often contradicted by actual data.
All the more important that these partnerships between industry and democracy are supervised by the public, and they you know, mutually check and balance each other, I suppose.
Yeah.
I have a last question that's exactly focusing on that one. I will be also the last for this event. On the global topic, there have been efforts by major companies to democratize the access and development of tech to developing countries. Do you think this is a way forward?
Yes. I want to see
these
more
are always
democracy.
like worst questions that you can answer with a yes or a no. So then, yes, why?
Finally, yes question. I would like to see technology become more democratic. And by that, I mean diversity and inclusion, not because it's politically correct or woke, which some critics would argue, but because I think you genuinely have to be aware of things like groupthink. It's very easy to hire for somebody because you think it's about cultural fit, when actually you're just looking for someone who's like you. And I think subconsciously we're actually very primed to do that, because human beings are looking to form our little tribes and relationships. So it's hard to hire somebody or to work with somebody who isn't exactly comfortable for you. But you need those people in your teams, and they will be the people who will spot the things that you are missing, and you will be very grateful for them. And I certainly have been. So I've been very grateful for that diversity of thinking in my career, and it scares me when I don't have it. So I would love to see that. I think that's a great point and a lovely note to end this on, and to say I would love to hear from anyone who wants to get in touch about where they think I need to hear some diversity in thinking in my views, because I've just been in lockdown thinking alone with my books. So let me know.
Thanks, Steph. That's been like very inspiring, a great presentation and a great talk. Thanks to everybody who sponsored their questions into this dialogue. Thanks to Vodafone, the Vodafone Institute. Thanks to Inga and the team to facilitate this AI&I digital salon. I hope to see you guys soon. We will be having another edition of the series. Thank you very much for joining in. Thanks, Steph, and thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.